I was 19 when my uncle became my lecturer. He failed my papers, humiliated me in front of the class, then accused me of cheating and had me suspended. I thought my future was over. What he didn't know was that my mother owned the college. And by the time the truth surfaced, his authority was already collapsing. When my uncle became a lecturer, I was still a student, and at the time it felt like nothing more than another chapter in a family story that never quite included me. I was used to being on the edge of things, watching adults talk over me, decisions being made in rooms I wasn't invited into. I didn't know that the moment his appointment letter was signed, a quiet war had already begun. One I would walk into blind, unprotected, and completely unaware of who truly owned the battlefield. I didn't know my mother owned the college. I didn't know my silence was being tested. And I didn't know how far a man will go when power finally gives him a voice. My name is Daniel Rowe. I was 19 when everything started to unravel, old enough to believe effort was enough, young enough to believe fairness was automatic. Crestfall College was not a place that rewarded innocence. It rewarded obedience, image, and hierarchy. The campus looked peaceful from the outside. Brick buildings wrapped in ivy, manicured lawns, old bells that rang on schedule. But inside, it functioned like a quiet machine that crushed anyone who didn't understand where they stood. I didn't understand. My mother never prepared me for that kind of world. She raised me to observe, to listen, to speak only when necessary. She believed silence could protect you. What she didn't say was that silence also reveals others. She worked long hours, always dressed plainly, always tired but composed. When people asked what she did, she said education consulting and changed the subject. I never pushed. She never lied to me outright. She just never told me the full truth. At the time, I thought it was because she wanted a simple life. I didn't know it was because she wanted a clear view of people when they thought no one powerful was watching. My Uncle Victor Rowe was the opposite of my mother in every way. Where she was reserved, he was loud. Where she was disciplined, he was bitter. He failed twice at private businesses, once at politics, and blamed everyone but himself. When Crestfall College hired him as a lecturer, he treated it like a crown being placed on his head. At family gatherings, he spoke endlessly about students needing firm control and institutions being too soft. He looked at me often when he said it like he was already practicing authority. My mother never corrected him. She never encouraged him either. She just watched, quietly, the way someone watches a storm forming in the distance. The semester Victor started teaching was the same semester I unknowingly enrolled in his course. Ethics and Institutional Leadership. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't destroyed me. The first day he walked into the lecture hall, confident and smiling, the room fell silent. He had the voice of someone who liked being listened to. When he read the attendance list and reached my name, he paused, lifted his head. Our eyes met. For a moment, something dark flickered behind his smile. Recognition mixed with satisfaction. He didn't acknowledge me directly. He didn't have to. From that moment on, I was no longer just a student. The changes were subtle at first. Questions I answered were partially correct. Essays that took me nights to complete were returned with dismissive comments. When I approached him respectfully after class, he kept his tone professional but cold. Once, he closed the door and said, "In here, I'm not your uncle. Remember that." I nodded, embarrassed, believing I had crossed some invisible boundary. I didn't realize that boundary only existed for me. By mid-semester, I felt the room shift whenever I spoke. Other students avoided sitting near me. Whispers followed me through corridors. I heard my name paired with words like favored and connected. It made me sick. I was being punished for favoritism I never received. Victor was careful. He never raised his voice. He never acted emotional. He weaponized procedure, subjective grading, participation scores, administrative language that left no fingerprints. I studied harder, thinking merit would save me. Merit doesn't matter when someone wants you to fall quietly. The accusation came 2 weeks before finals. Plagiarism. The word hit me like a slap. A formal notice. A hearing. Evidence presented by Victor himself. Similar phrasing. conceptual overlap, academic dishonesty. I recognized my own work, twisted into something suspicious. During the hearing, I spoke, but my voice sounded foreign in my ears. The panel members nodded politely but avoided my eyes. The decision felt predetermined. I was suspended for a semester, my academic record stained, my future uncertain. When I left the room, Victor didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Power had already spoken. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I went home and told my mother I needed time away from school. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question. Who accused you? When I said his name, her face didn't change. That frightened me more than anger would have. That night, she placed a folder on the table between us. Inside were documents I didn't understand at first. Ownership records, founding charters, legal language, Crestfall College, majority ownership, Marion Rowe, my mother. The ground shifted beneath me. The college that had humiliated me belonged to the woman who raised me. I asked why she never told me. She said, because power changes how people treat you. I needed to know who they were before they knew who I was. She didn't rush to confront Victor. That was the hardest part. She waited. She observed. She ordered audits quietly. Anonymous surveys. Independent reviews. Patterns emerged. Victor's behavior wasn't isolated. Grade manipulation. Abuse of authority. Pressure tactics. I was simply one of many. The difference was that I survived long enough for the truth to surface. When the board meeting was called, it was framed as routine. Victor arrived confident. Faculty filled the room. Then my mother entered. Not as my mother, as the founder, as the owner. Silence swallowed the hall. Evidence was presented calmly. Names were read. Patterns explained. Victor tried to interrupt, but his microphone was cut. His authority vanished in seconds. He was removed that day. No shouting. No drama. Just consequences. My suspension was erased. My record restored. But the lesson remained. Power reveals people. Silence exposes them. I graduated changed. Quieter. Stronger. More aware. Revenge didn't feel loud. It felt like balance returning to a place that had lost it. Because borrowed power always expires. After Victor was removed, the campus didn't erupt the way people imagine justice should. There were no cheers, no viral videos, no dramatic headlines. Institutions don't fall loudly. They adjust quietly, like a body correcting its balance after a long sickness. Classes resumed. Lecturers avoided discussing it. Students whispered for a week, then focused on exams. Only those who had been hurt felt the aftershock. I was one of them. Even with my record restored, something fundamental had changed. I no longer believed effort alone protected you. I no longer believed silence was always safety. I had seen how easily truth could be buried under procedure, and how power only listened when it feared exposure. My mother didn't celebrate. She didn't even speak Victor's name again. She returned to her routines, leaving Crestfall's restructuring to the board, only stepping in when absolutely necessary. One evening, I asked her if it hurt. She looked at me for a long time before answering. It hurt the moment he chose power over people, she said. Everything after that was already decided. That was the first time I understood revenge doesn't require hatred. It requires clarity. Returning to campus felt like walking through a place that remembered me differently. Some students looked at me with curiosity, others with sympathy, a few with guilt, none with authority. Professors treated me cautiously now, measuring their words. The same system that ignored me before now moved around me carefully, not because they respected me, but because they feared what they didn't know. I hated that. I hated that power worked that way, but pretending it didn't exist wouldn't change it. During my final year, I started noticing things I had ignored before. Students dropping courses suddenly. Complaints disappearing into administrative silence. Faculty protected by tenure behaving recklessly. Crestfall wasn't broken because of one man. Victor was only a symptom. The system rewarded those who understood how to hide inside it. I told my mother what I saw. She listened the way she always had. She didn't promise change. She asked questions instead. Specific ones. Dangerous ones. Behind closed doors, reforms began. Quiet audits. Policy revisions. Oversight committees with real authority, not decorative titles. Some administrators resigned for personal reasons. Others were reassigned. No announcements were made. The college didn't want another scandal. But something shifted. Complaints started receiving responses. Students felt heard. Fear retreated, slowly. Not gone, but weakened. Victor attempted to contact me once. An email. Short. Defensive. He blamed stress, misunderstanding, politics. He never apologized. I didn't reply. Silence was no longer weakness to me. It was a decision. Later, I heard he tried teaching elsewhere. His reputation followed him. Academia has a long memory when it chooses to. Graduation day arrived quietly. My mother sat in the audience, unnoticed. No one knew she owned the institution they were celebrating. She preferred it that way. When my name was called, I walked across the stage knowing something no one else did. I didn't feel powerful. I felt aware. Awareness is heavier than pride. After graduation, I didn't stay at Crestfall. I could have. Doors were open. Offers implied. I chose distance instead. I wanted my success to be mine, unshadowed. My mother understood. She always had. We never spoke publicly about what happened. We didn't need to. The story existed where it mattered. Years later, I work in policy analysis, specializing in institutional accountability. I study systems the way my mother taught me to observe people. Quietly, patiently, looking for patterns instead of excuses. Sometimes, I encounter students who remind me of myself. Quiet, overlooked, believing fairness is automatic. I don't shatter their belief. I guide it gently, because cynicism without purpose is just another trap. I learned something most people don't learn until it's too late. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it cooks your meals. Sometimes it walks beside you silently. Sometimes it waits to see who you become when you think no one important is watching. My uncle thought authority made him untouchable. He forgot borrowed power has an expiration date. My mother knew. She always did. If you're listening to this story and you feel invisible, understand this. Invisibility can be protection. It can also be preparation. The people who underestimate you are revealing more than they know. Watch them. Learn them. Because when the truth finally arrives, it won't need to shout. It will simply stand there, undeniable. This wasn't a story about revenge the way movies show it. There were no dramatic confrontations, no screaming matches, no public humiliation. It was about consequences arriving quietly, the way they should. It was about power learning humility. And it was about a student who never knew his mother owned the college, discovering that real authority doesn't need to be seen to be absolute. Time has a way of softening events without erasing their meaning. In the years after I left Crestfall, the story became something people referenced without details. That lecturer incident, the internal shakeup, it was reduced to institutional shorthand, stripped of faces and consequences. But for the students who lived through it, the memory stayed sharp. I stayed in contact with a few of them, quietly at first, then more openly. What I learned unsettled me more than Victor ever had. One girl had switched majors after failing his course twice, convinced she wasn't intelligent enough for leadership. A scholarship student from a rural background dropped out entirely after being accused of unprofessional conduct for questioning grading criteria. A teaching assistant confided that Victor routinely pressured him to alter participation scores to send messages. These weren't rumors. They were patterns. And patterns don't disappear just because one person is removed. They wait. I brought this to my mother not as an accusation, but as an observation. She listened, then surprised me by asking, "Do you know why I never interfered in your academic life?" I thought I did. To protect my independence. To avoid favoritism. She shook her head. Because institutions rot when leaders protect individuals instead of principles. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she'd ever said. Crestfall's reforms continued slowly, painfully. There were moments the board resisted, moments donors complained, moments when my mother was advised to let things settle. She refused. Not loudly, not publicly. She simply didn't stop. Policies became enforceable instead of decorative. Anonymous reporting gained teeth. External review panels were made permanent, not reactive. Some faculty resented it. Those were usually the ones who had benefited from ambiguity. Victor resurfaced once more indirectly. A colleague forwarded me an article he'd written online about the decay of academic authority. He spoke of students needing discipline, of institutions losing respect, of power being undermined by oversight. He never mentioned his dismissal. He never mentioned ethics. Reading it, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, pity. He still believed authority was something taken, not earned. Some people never learn because learning would require admitting they were never entitled in the first place. My mother retired from active leadership a few years later, stepping back into advisory roles. Crestfall announced it with polite gratitude, careful not to emphasize how long she'd already been shaping it from the shadows. She didn't attend the ceremony. She was at home, tending to her garden, dirt under her fingernails, content. Institutions should outgrow their founders, she told me. If they don't, they were never healthy. I asked her once if she regretted hiding the truth from me for so long. She considered it carefully. Regret implies a better alternative, she said. You learned what you needed to learn without shortcuts. She was right. If I had known from the beginning, I would have walked through Crestfall armored. I would never have seen how quickly people exploit what they think is weakness. I would never have understood how silence can be a mirror. As my career developed, I was invited to consult on cases involving academic misconduct, abuse of authority, and institutional cover-ups. Every case was different. Every story had its own pain, but the structure was always familiar. Someone with power, someone without it, a system designed to protect itself first, and always silence mistaken for consent. I never told my story during those consultations. I didn't need to. Experience speaks in how you ask questions, how you notice what's missing. Sometimes I wonder what Victor tells himself now, whether he believes he was wronged, whether he blames my mother, or me, or politics. People rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims of unfair rules. That belief is more dangerous than malice. Malice can be confronted. Self-justification hides forever. Crestfall still stands. Students still walk its paths, unaware of the quiet battles fought to make those paths safer. That's how it should be. Justice isn't meant to be commemorated like a monument. It's meant to disappear into normalcy, leaving fairness behind as if it had always been there. If there's a lesson in all this, it isn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It's about restraint, about knowing when to act and when to watch, about understanding that power used recklessly exposes itself eventually, and about recognizing that sometimes the most devastating consequence isn't public humiliation, but removal, the loss of an audience, the silence that follows when no one is required to listen anymore. I was 19 when my uncle became a lecturer and treated authority like a weapon. I was older when I realized he had never truly held it. Authority without integrity is just noise with consequences. And borrowed power, no matter how confidently worn, always expires. This story didn't end with triumph. It ended with understanding. And understanding lasts longer than anger ever could. There is a stage after understanding that few people talk about. It's the stage where clarity settles in, not like relief, but like weight. Once you see how power actually works, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing it in rooms that used to feel neutral, in conversations that sound polite but carry sharp edges underneath. I entered that stage quietly, without announcing it to myself. It revealed itself in the way I listened more than I spoke, in how I stopped assuming good intentions were enough. Several years after Crestfall, I was invited back. Not as a student, not as faculty, but as an external observer on an institutional ethics panel. The irony wasn't lost on me. I walked the same corridors where I once felt erased, now holding a visitor badge that granted me access everywhere. No one recognized me. That anonymity felt right. It reminded me why my mother had stayed invisible for so long. When people don't know who you are, they show you who they are. During that visit, I sat in on closed-door discussions about complaints that never made it into official reports. A pattern emerged that felt disturbingly familiar. Not identical to Victor's actions, but shaped by the same soil. Authority drifting unchecked. Procedures interpreted selectively. Students afraid to push back because they had too much to lose. Systems don't repeat people. They repeat behaviors. One case involved a senior professor protected by reputation rather than evidence. Another involved a department head who blurred boundaries while insisting everything was misunderstood. Listening to these cases, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, responsibility. I realized then that my story didn't end when Victor was removed. That was just the moment I was forced to see the machinery. Walking away completely would mean pretending the machine didn't still exist. My recommendations were precise, unemotional, and difficult to ignore. Documentation requirements tightened. Oversight responsibilities shifted outside departmental hierarchies. Whistleblower protections were expanded in ways that couldn't be quietly reversed later. Some panel members resisted. They always do. Change threatens comfort more than it threatens wrongdoing. But discomfort isn't damage. It's correction. After the session, I stood alone in the old courtyard where students used to gather between classes. I remembered how small I felt there once, how carefully I used to move, afraid of attracting attention. That version of me wasn't weak. He was unarmed. There's a difference people rarely acknowledge. That night, I called my mother. She listened as I described the visit. When I finished, she said, "Now you understand why I stayed. Not stayed silent, stayed present. Institutions don't need saviors. They need witnesses who refuse to leave when it becomes inconvenient." Victor's name surfaced again years later, this time through a legal dispute. He was suing an institution that declined to renew his contract, claiming defamation based on unproven allegations from his past. I was asked, unofficially, whether Crestfall's records still existed. They did. Meticulously archived. Independent reviews don't forget. His case dissolved quietly. No apology followed. None was expected. I thought about writing to him once. Not to accuse. Not to lecture. Just to ask one question. Did you ever wonder why no one defended you? I never sent it. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to echo. As the years went on, my relationship with my mother evolved. We spoke less about Crestfall and more about life beyond institutions. She aged gently, deliberately. She never claimed credit for what she built. When people praised Crestfall's culture reforms publicly, she deflected. Many people contributed, she'd say. It was true. But contribution isn't the same as direction. She had known where to push and where to wait. That restraint had been her greatest strength. Near the end of her active years, she told me something she had never shared before. Crestfall wasn't her first institution. Early in her career, she had watched a different college collapse under unchecked authority. She had tried to speak up then. She was ignored. "I learned," she said, "that if you want to protect people, you don't always start by being visible. You start by being patient." That patience had shaped my entire life without me knowing it. Looking back, I see my suspension not as humiliation, but as initiation. It forced me to confront reality before comfort could dull my awareness. It showed me that fairness is not automatic. It must be designed, defended, and constantly revised. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never been powerless. This story is often labeled revenge. That word makes it easier to consume, suggests emotion, payoff, closure. But revenge implies intent to harm. This was intent to correct, to rebalance, to remove weight from a scale that had been leaning for too long. The satisfaction, if there was any, came not from Victor's fall, but from the quiet prevention of future ones. If you're listening and you've been wronged by someone who hides behind authority, Understand this. Not every battle is meant to be fought immediately. Some are meant to be documented. Some are meant to be waited out. And some require you to survive long enough to be believed. Power fears patience more than anger, because patience keeps records. I was once a student who didn't know his mother owned the college. I thought that made me powerless. In truth, it gave me the clearest education I could have received. I learned how systems reveal themselves when they think no one important is watching. And I learned that the quietest people in the room often know exactly where the foundations are weakest. This isn't the end of the story in the way stories usually end. There's no final confrontation, no dramatic reckoning scene. There's just continuity, vigilance, and the knowledge that borrowed power, no matter how confidently it speaks, is always temporary. There is a moment, long after the noise fades, when a story settles into something quieter than memory. It becomes perspective. That's where this one lives for me now. Not as a wound, not as a victory, but as a lens through which I see the world more clearly than I ever could before. Years after my last formal involvement with Crestfall, I received a letter from a student I had never met. She had found my name listed on an ethics review report and tracked me down through professional channels. Her message was simple. She had filed a complaint against a department administrator. She was afraid. She wanted to know if staying silent was safer. I read her words slowly, recognizing the fear between the lines. Fear doesn't shout. It hesitates. I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what silence had cost others, and what patience had given me. I told her to document everything, to protect herself first, and to remember that truth doesn't expire just because people want it to. Weeks later, she wrote again. The investigation had begun. She wasn't alone anymore. That was when I understood something important. Stories don't end when they're told. They continue in the decisions they influence. My mother passed away quietly one winter morning, years after she had stepped fully away from institutional life. There were no public announcements linking her name to Crestfall. That was intentional. At her request, her obituary mentioned only a lifelong advocate for education. Those who needed to know already did. Power, to her, was never about recognition. It was about stewardship, about leaving something healthier than you found it. Standing in her empty house afterward, surrounded by books and handwritten notes, I found an old journal. Inside were observations, not confessions. Names without commentary. Dates without emotion. She had been watching systems long before I ever entered one. My entire education had been shaped by that watchfulness. She hadn't hidden the truth from me out of secrecy. She had waited until I was ready to understand it without being consumed by it. Victor never reached out again. I don't know where he is now, and I don't try to find out. Some stories don't require updates. His relevance ended the moment his authority did. That's the quiet ending people rarely talk about. The loss of influence. No audience. No platform. Just a voice that echoes only inside its own justifications. I sometimes imagine an alternate version of my life. One where my uncle was fair. Where I passed through Crestfall unnoticed. Where my mother revealed everything early and shielded me from harm. That version of me might have been happier sooner. But he would have been blind. Comfort teaches nothing about power. Friction does. If you've listened this far, it's probably because some part of this story resonates with you. Maybe you've been underestimated. Maybe you've been punished quietly. Maybe you've watched someone misuse authority while everyone else looked away. If there's one truth I want you to take from this, it's this: systems don't change because someone yells. They change because someone stays long enough to understand where pressure actually works. Revenge is loud. Justice is methodical. And accountability is patient. I was once a student who didn't know his mother owned the college. That ignorance felt like weakness. In hindsight, it was my greatest protection. It allowed the truth to reveal itself fully, without interference. It allowed people to show their values when they thought no consequences existed. And when consequences finally arrived, they weren't fueled by anger, but by evidence. Borrowed power always expires. It just doesn't always announce when. Sometimes it fades in a meeting room, sometimes in a policy revision, sometimes in a silence where applause used to be, and sometimes it disappears because someone who was underestimated learned how to wait. This story doesn't ask for outrage. It asks for awareness, because the most dangerous abuses of power don't look dramatic. They look ordinary. They look procedural. They look like rules being applied. And they survive because people assume someone else will speak. I didn't know my mother owned the college, but I learned who truly owned responsibility. And that lesson has followed me everywhere.